be able to present this event today. Before we begin with our topic of does gender matter in organized racism, a couple of things. One, there's a sign-in sheet, and it would be a very nice thing if everybody signed in. So it should be floating around. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors who assisted in publicizing this talk. This includes the African American Studies Department, the Beatrice Bain Research Group, the Gender and Women's Studies Department, and the Sociology Department. I'd also like to introduce, just to make a couple of announcements of upcoming events. On Thursday, April 6th, from 12 to 1:30 in this room, 370 Winnell, the Center for the Comparative Study of Right-Wing Movements will host a talk by Mark Lilla on the concept of reaction. Lilla is Professor of Humanities at Columbia University, specializing in intellectual history, with a focus on political and religious thought. Martin Jay, the Sidney Hellman Urban Professor of History at UC Berkeley, will serve as the respondent at Lilla's talk. On Wednesday, April 21st, I will present a paper called The Culture of Paranoia, Tracing the Breakdown of the Conservative Ascendancy. This event will be sponsored by the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues and will take place 4 to 5:30 p.m. in the Vildovsky Conference Room at the Institute, which is at 2538 Cheney Way. Thank you for your patience on that. Okay. Today, our speaker is Kathleen Blee, who is a distinguished professor of sociology and history and chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of Pittsburgh. She has published 2 books on racist movements in the U.S., Inside Organized Racism, Women in the Hate Movement, and Women of the Klan, Racism and Gender in the 1920s. She's written extensively on methodological issues that arise when studying difficult and inaccessible populations. That doesn't even begin to get out what she studies, but including issues of emotion, reflexivity, legal and ethical concerns, and sampling problems. She has also co-authored a book on the historical development of poverty, The Road to Poverty, edited 2 volumes on women in protest movements, and is now completing a book on comparative ethnography of emerging social movements. She's co-editor with Sandy Deutsch of Women of the Right, Comparisons and Exchanges Across National Borders, which will appear next year from Penn State University Press, which builds on the path-breaking volume, Right-Wing Women, From Conservatives to Extremists Around the World, that was co-edited by our respondent, Paola Baqueta and Margaret Power. Our respondent is Paola Baqueta. She is Associate Professor in the Gender and Women's Studies Department here at Berkeley. She's Director of the Beatrice Bain Research Group, which fosters research on gender and its interactions with sexuality, race, class, nation, and religion. Her PhD is in sociology from the Sorbonne. Her geographic areas of specialization outside the U.S. are India and France. She's the author of Gender in the Hindu Nation, RSS Women as Ideologists, co-editor of Right-Wing Women, which we mentioned previously, and she's published numerous articles and book chapters on gender, sexuality, race, racism, post-coloniality, Hindu nationalism, decolonial feminist and queer movements in India. And her work has been published in the US, France, Italy, Canada, Britain, and Australia. Her articles are accessible in such journals as Social Text, Feminist Studies, Journal of Women's History, and many others. It's a pleasure to have both of them here. And without further ado, Kathleen Blee.
Thank you, Larry, and Christine Prost for all the arrangements. I can't tell you how great it is to be here. It's like an intellectually stimulating environment but in an environment that doesn't have 4 feet of snow on the ground like Pittsburgh does. Yes. I've spent a considerable amount of time in my life studying women in the far right, especially in organized racist movements in the United States. Today what I want to do is step back and talk about scholarship on racist women, mine and others, and how it has both enabled and circumscribed what we know about a larger question: does gender matter in racist movements? In other words, I want to first consider how it became possible to see women as significant racist actors, and what limits on perception were introduced by these early studies. I want to use as examples 2 of my studies of women who were involved in 2 different waves of organized racism. One of them was the massive Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s, which was the second historical wave of the Klan after its beginning in the post-Civil War Reconstruction era South. This second Klan had a number of features that distinguish it from Klans before or after. For one, it had a very heavy presence in the northern states, not so much in the South, and particularly in urban areas. Its agenda included electoral power, as well as violence and terrorism. That it was successful in electing state and community officials in a number of states and communities speaks to its ability to command very broad support. It operated with an expansive and often kind of locally elastic sense of enemies. Its enemies included African Americans, Jews, but also Catholics, recent immigrants, labor radicals, Mormons for Klans in Utah, and so forth. And it's also distinctive in that it opened its membership to women. Indeed, women poured into the second Klan in vast numbers, accounting for probably about 500,000 or more members out of the 3 to 5 million members of the second Klan. Which, you think about it, these are staggering numbers, because to be in the Klan you had to be white, native-born, and Protestant, which is so it's a very significant percent of people in those categories. In many places and nationally, women in the 1920s created their own clans, separate and even antagonistic at times to the men's clans. The other examples I want to use are from today's racist movements, which consist of overlapping, often antagonistic, and generally pretty tiny groups of neo-Nazis, white power skinheads, some Ku Klux Klan members, and sort of random assorted white supremacists, along with a loosely networked set of racist cells and what are called lone wolf practitioners of racist violence. Since the 1980s, actually, on the impetus of David Duke, most of these have recruited women, resulting in a pretty substantial female cadre that is deeply committed to the principles of white supremacism and to a particularly virulent form of anti-Semitism today, in which Jews are regarded as the literal descendants of Satan. So not in league with the devil, but actually as embodied demons. Modern racists simultaneously fear, but also desire to advance, an apocalyptic race war. And many of them support tactics and ideologies of terrorism to further worldwide Aryan supremacy. What I want to do today is talk about 5 conceptual templates that have made some aspects of gendered racism visible while obscuring others. These are the template that racists are men, the prototype of Nazi Germany, a template of historical continuity, one of causal order, and finally a template of gender itself. In addition to noting that these templates exist, I want to consider the imprints that such templates leave behind even after they are debunked or disappear. As theories of path dependency show, founding conditions and early events can have enduring effects on what's possible later. So drawing on that notion, I want to think about how early studies of women in organized racism left impressions or legacies that shape what is studied today. I want to begin with two templates that initially made it difficult to see women in racist movements. And I want to apologize for the photos, which are, to put it mildly, disturbing. The first template is that of the male racist. In the last 3 decades, there have been many studies of women in movements of the far right, not only in U.S. organized racism, but also in European and Latin American fascism, Hindu nationalism in India, Chinese anti-communism, and many others. There have been so many such studies, in fact, that it's difficult to imagine that the far right was initially assumed to be male, but it assuredly was. When studies of women on the right emerged about 2 decades ago, with, among others, Claudia Kunz's chilling account of women who served as the willing mothers in the German Nazi fatherland, these were often heralded as scholarly discoveries, an unearthing of new facts about women's activism and the nature of the far right. But at least in the case of U.S. organized racism, and maybe elsewhere, feminist scholars did not, quote, discover that women had participated in the far right. The fact of women's involvement was not hidden in a dusty archive or inaccessible racist group awaiting the arrival of an intrepid scholar. Rather, such facts lay in plain sight, invisible only because they weren't seen as meaningful and significant. It took a feminist lens, centering women's experience, to move beyond this template and to see, for example, that Klanswomen in the 1920s were more than simple auxiliaries to Klansmen, and therefore just political non-entities not worth investigating. Historians had long known that women clans existed in the 1920s, even that some of these women's clans contended for power and money with their male counterparts. But the assumption that women's activism was necessarily auxiliary to, or derived from, men's, made it impossible to see how women organized racial and religious bigotry. That is, how these women made hate in particular ways and often to tremendous effect. For example, leaders of the 1920s Klan, the Women's Klan, did not appear from nowhere, nor were they the puppet of male Klan leaders. Rather, many of these women leaders came to the Klan after decades of working to promote women's right to vote, an effort that these women undertook to counteract the suffrage that had earlier been given to African American men. They brought to the Klan the political skills and networks that were honed in suffrage activism, allowing them to fashion tactics uniquely tailored for women, and ones that were often more effectively destructive and violent than the traditional night-riding tactics of the men's Klan in that period. I'll give you just one example. Klanswomen in the 1920s developed networks of sympathetic women through which they could systematically spread rumors. What men, both in the Klan and among its opposition, derisively called, quote, poison squads of whispering women, end quote, spread tales of spoiled meat that destroyed the livelihoods of Jewish merchants, rumors of sexual attacks that drove African American men from their homes and communities, and stories of papal conspiracies used as evidence to fire Catholic teachers from their public school jobs. That scholars could see women as racist political actors in their own right was a first stage of gender transformation, making it clear that the project of white supremacy in the US had not been solely a male enterprise. It also contributed to a second stage of feminist transformation, that of using the experience of women to rethink analytic categories, or as Susan Lebsack says, using women's history to make us smarter about the world. Paying attention to women in the Second Klan meant rethinking the idea of collective racial violence, illuminating dimensions of racial terror that lie behind its public face in the hidden rumor mills of whispering women. It pointed to complexities of racist ideologies which could stretch to embrace women's suffrage without disturbing an anti-egalitarian core. It showed that something important about organized racism couldn't be seen without looking simultaneously at gender. In other words, that organized racism itself was gendered. The second template I want to mention is that of German Nazism. Early studies of US racist women took place against the second conceptual template, that the prototypical form of organized racism was World War II era German Nazism. This combines several ideas. One was the notion that organized racism grows in an explosive and exponential fashion, as in Nazi Germany. The second was that organized racism is the product of macro-level crises, economic, political, national. And the third was that widespread organized racism appears when its authoritarian goals fit the rigid and hierarchical family, parenting, and personality structures of the population as a whole. The template of racism in the US as a variant of the Nazi experience made it difficult to see racist women because it implied that the significance of rightist movements lay in their size and their rate of growth. As numerical minorities in racist groups, women were assumed to matter proportionately less, actually not at all. Moreover, the idea that organized racism is a product of frustration and authoritarianism underscored its masculinist nature. Racism attracted men worried about their eroding power in the family as well as in society. The shift away from the template of German Nazism in US scholarship on the right came about in part because major waves of racist activity in this country don't fit that template very well. Racism doesn't correlate well with economic cycles, for one. For another, probably the largest wave of organized racism in this country, the 20s, was not centered in the tumultuous northern cities where native-born whites sought to maintain their stake in jobs and housing against new immigrants from Europe, Eastern and Southern Europe in particular, and African Americans arriving from the rural South. Rather, the 1920s Klan took deep root in relatively homogeneous and demographically stable places like Indiana. As the German Nazi template crumbled to be replaced by a theory of rational action on the right, there was increasing evidence of women in organized racism in the US, and scholars faced a quandary. White men who were privileged in economic life, public politics, and the family, they certainly had a clear interest in racist appeals to traditionalism and social hierarchies. That these men's anger and fear would lead them into the right was understandable, if unfortunate. It was rational, it was self-interested. But why women would find the right appealing, however, was unexplained, even inexplicable, except by recourse to psychological notions of irrationality or false identification of their needs. Gender was not peripheral to the right in this template. Indeed, it was paramount. Racist mobilization was explained by gender. Men enlist in their own male interest. Women join, well, maybe because they're confused, they're led astray by male intimates, or they incorrectly identify their interests. That the mechanisms of gender were assumed by the template meant they did not need to be investigated. On the other hand, finding that women played a role as racist actors helped move the analytic lens away from macro trends of social dislocation and collective frustration, and toward how organized racism could be built within the fabric of everyday experience. It shifted, in other words, where we might look for the foundation of racist mobilization, away from the extraordinary forces of social and political upheaval, and toward the ordinary, mundane practices of daily life. The Klan of the 1920s, for example, set itself within the framework of ordinary, taken-for-granted life in the heavily white, native-born Protestant cities and towns of places like Indiana. Its myriad of clannish rituals and events, from Klan weddings, pie-eating contests, fairs, and junior girls' clans and clandals, to clannish father-son sporting events, illuminate the casual insertion of racism into everyday life, rather than an embrace of racism as a defense against dislocation and frustration. Now, in the wake of challenges to the male and Nazi German templates of organized racism, new templates emerged that took account of rational action and women's participation, yet also introduced new limitations. One is the template of racist continuity. As the Nazi German template was criticized for reducing organized racism to individual pathology, scholars in the U.S. increasingly turned to thinking about collective racism in this country as a social or political movement. This allowed analysis of two levels that were obscured in Nazi German templates that were focused on macro-social and micro-personality aspects. One of these new aspects was mobilization, the question of why people might join racist movements, what incentives prove most powerful, and how people become interested in and acquainted with such movements. The other idea introduced by a shift to looking at racism as a social movement was an emphasis on strategy and tactics, how racist movements recruit members, what incentives they provide, and how they frame issues and ideologies. The concepts of social movement analysis have proven quite productive for studies of U.S. racism. They make it possible to understand, for example, the preponderance of racist women activists today who tend to be overall pretty highly educated and from stable middle-class families. Indeed, a far cry from the frustrated, dislocated, or marginal members that earlier templates would have predicted. Such women join racist movements as a product of deliberate strategies by white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups, less so actually by clans, who send recruiters to cultivate women in the ordinary settings of middle-class life, striking up conversations on playgrounds, at meetings of environmental groups, they're really big on environmental groups, in grocery stores, and in birthing preparation classes like Lamaze. The move to thinking of organized racism as a social movement, however, has not been without problems. One problem is that it risks making organized racism seem more coherent and continuous than it actually is, suggesting that it's a phenomena whose variations across race and context are simply instances of an underlying case. But is that true? Does the concept of a racist social movement in the U.S. have analytic integrity? Consider the Klan. In its 4 historical periods of activity, the Klan uses similar rituals and regalia, always the same outfits, And it always promotes white supremacism, and it usually promotes violent means to achieve it. Yet there are significant differences across and even within time. I've already mentioned that women are in the 1920s and in the current Klans, yet they were excluded from the initial Reconstruction era Klan and largely absent in the 1960s Klans. More strikingly, issues of gender do not map onto historical fluctuations in women's participation in the Klans. Gender was central in the Reconstruction era in the 1920s, when white women's sexual integrity was posited as under threat by African American men, lusting priests, and exploitative Jewish businessmen. But gender issues rarely appear in any form in the 1960s Klan, and today they are the subject of division and conflict within Klan groups. What's true of gender and women's participation is true more widely. African Americans were the targeted enemy in Reconstruction in the 60s Klan, but other groups, especially Jews and Catholics, were central in the 1920s and today. Nationalism is important in the 1920s, which actually called itself the 100% American Klan. But nationalism was divisive in the Reconstruction era Klan and the States' Rights Klan of the 1960s, and it's pretty much disappearing in the Klans today, which instead are promoting global pan-Aryanism. I could go on, but the point is that the ideologies, the compositions, and the focus of the Klan are inconsistent over time in ways that defy easy categorization. Women aren't becoming more or less central, neither is social class or sexuality or race. The problem with regarding organized racism as a thing, a continuous thing, is twofold. One is methodological. Social phenomena that look the same from afar can look very different up close. From a distance, taking what feminist theorist Dorothy Smith calls disparagingly a bird's eye view of social life, from a distance, a Klan seems to be a category of racist practices that exists over time. A bunch of angry men, garbed in similar outfits, eager to blame their problems on racialized others. From up close, however, the Klan looks so different over time, both ideologically and organizationally, that it might be a stretch to think of it even as a single kind of movement. The other issue, maybe more disturbing, is representational. What constitutes an instance, a case of the Klan, is not self-evident. Rather, the Klan, an historically semi-continuous movement of white supremacism, that's an image that's produced by the Klan itself as well as by its opponents. At each era, Klan leaders position themselves and their group in an historical trajectory as the authentic heirs to a long-standing tradition of white resistance to racial integration and equality. That's the significance of Stone Mountain, Georgia, the site of every Klan rebirth that imparts a sense of historical singularity. And scholars, too, often cooperate in the effort to represent the Klan as more coherent than is the case, by casting it as a social movement, a category, a kind. Even in the single era, however, the Klan is just not an entity, despite its efforts to represent itself this way, but rather a collection of similarly attired but only vaguely connected and often contending groups. The move from collective pathology to social movements as a template for organized racism, then, however beneficial, can create the misleading impression that it's easy to know how gender matters in organized racism, beyond the specifications of time, place, and context. The casual assertions of connection between gender and collective racism that appear in various scholarly forms are problematic indeed if the underlying phenomena, that of organized racism, is not itself an entity. The fourth template is one of causality. More specifically, the idea that people come into racist movements because they have racist ideas, or to put it more abstractly, that racist ideas precede and cause racist affiliation and racist action. But is that always the case? Here I want to consider a case of a man, actually, Sean Gaines, who is described by an observer, quote, as a skinhead, 230 pounds of red lace, jack-booted aggression, reckless and bravado, notorious for flashing his gun 1 minute at white power gatherings and his penis the next, end quote. Sean was raised by a drug-addicted father, fond of racial epithets. He learned to steal cars and cook meth at an early age. By 16, he and his father were involved in a vicious torture murder of a Native American man. 10 years later, now a committed racial skinhead, Sean's spree of violence and mayhem all over the country ended with his arrest for capital murder. Now, at first glance, Sean's biography fits the stereotypical sense of the path into racial extremism. He was schooled into racial ideas by his father, he turned to violence against racial minorities, and he became a skinhead. Yet, if you look up close, Sean's story is more complicated. He had a hatred of racial minorities, but no idea really of white supremacy until he went to prison for the first time, where he met a racist skinhead named Odious. Odious gave Sean the opportunity to earn his first white pride tattoo for attacking a prisoner who owed him money, and Odious tried unsuccessfully to teach Sean the tenets of white power. By the time he left prison, Sean still knew little about the ideology behind the white power movement, but now he was convinced he was a skinhead, and he found and joined other skinheads on what they called hunting trips, lovely, to attack random minority members. It was on these trips, hanging out with skinheads, that Sean finally learned and adopted an ideology of white supremacy that fit his commitment to racist action. Sean's transition from acting like a racist to thinking like a racist is counter to the usual assumption that people develop an ideology and then they act on it. But it's not uncommon what happened to Sean. Many racists learn white supremacy by participating in racist actions, not the reverse. In the US today, for example, women racists tend to learn the virulent ideas of white supremacy because they join in racist protests, assaults, and violence. And they often join in these in the most casual manner, with little reflection on the ideas behind the actions. One skinhead, Sandy, told me she always loved to fight, that it made her feel alive and powerful. When she met people in a white power skinhead group, she recalled being instantly attracted to their aggressiveness, the way they talked of smashing their enemies. She joined them in street fights and in violent initiations of new members, and she soon became a regular. Only after fighting alongside them for some time did she learn and come to embrace their neo-Nazi beliefs. Now, Sean and Sandy's stories are not what we usually think, that people join racist groups because they hate racial minorities. In their cases, action came first, only later did they learn and adopt the ideologies. Failing to recognize this causal order not only misses the way that racist groups matter in organized racism, shaping the ideas as well as the passion of members, but it also can obscure one way that gender can matter. Most racist groups are themselves intensely structured by gender. All male leaders today, sex segregated in the 1920s. Thus, beliefs inculcated in racist groups reflect the gendered structures of these groups. For example, recruits generally enter these groups with some racist ideas about African Americans, often not all that different from racist ideas of other whites. As they become an active part of a racist group, however, their ideas are reshaped. They learn a new kind of racism, in which Jewish conspirators are said to manipulate whites and people of color for their own benefit, and in which the only true whites are those loyal to the white race. That is, racist groups create a form of racism quite different than the ordinary racism with which its followers began. Recruits learned this white supremacism within a highly gendered context. For example, the 14 words, which the slogan of white supremacism today is, "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children." These are taught to women and men very differently. Men learn racism as a practice of individual heroism in which the rules of gender are clear. Masculinity is demonstrated through racial violence and commitment. Women learn racism as a defensive posture, one in which the rules of gender are suspended. Women are called to actions, the baby, the gun, that are otherwise unimaginable, and for reasons, like honor, that are otherwise irrelevant, even banned from their lives. Racist activism for women is the upside-down carnival of possibility, however horrible. For men, it is the culmination of set understandings of white manhood. Finally, the template of gender. Again, a legacy of the past. There's a template that gender always matters, so that women and men's motives for racial activism will necessarily differ. Consider a 23-year-old Ariana arrested for her part in an attack and murder of a homeless man in Washington. The attack was carried out by Ariana and 3 men, among them her boyfriend, whose child she was carrying, and a 19-year-old male, a leader of a local neo-Nazi group. The 4 of them, all racist skinheads, had set out to attack this black drug dealer, initially they claimed, but instead attacked this man who was suffering from schizophrenia. Despite Ariana's statement that she was motivated by a desire to earn a pair of red shoelaces, which is a Nazi symbol of having taken violent action against a minority person, and her admission to kicking the homeless man hard in the head 3 or 4 times, nonetheless, prosecutors considered her to be under the influence of her male comrades and recommended a reduced sentence. Now, what happens in scholarship is not all that different from what happens in the legal system. Women's participation is firstly traced to private, affective, and domestic concerns, and these can swamp all other possibilities. When women become active racism in the common narrative, they extend their private concerns into the public. They stretch their maternalism or personal loyalties into broader efforts to protect intimate life writ large as the white race or the Aryan nation. The problem is not only that this is a narrow analytic lens, nor that it rests on a public-private dichotomy that legions of feminists have tried to undermine. The problem is that by assuming that gender, in this case a gender division of labor, is uniformly important, it undercuts our ability to see how gender can be more or less or differently salient across social arenas and in relationship to other forms of categories. Michael Schwartz observed that we can sometimes see things more clearly if we look at them indirectly. Perhaps this is true for gender as well. Might it be difficult to see how racism is gendered when we're looking for it, when we expect to find it in most movements, in most historical and spatial settings, when we assume it's important? Studies that look for gender in racist movements are easily caught up by the hyper-masculine character of these movements. They are rife with bravado, guns, threats, definitiveness, the belittling of others, strength, boast, swagger, and the embrace of social hierarchy. Yet there are other dynamics in these groups that are difficult to categorize as masculine. They're full of intrigue and gossip and treachery and drama and artifice, the centrality of bonds among members, performance, fear, and anxiety. Does this mean that masculinity is irrelevant? Assuredly not. But it does suggest that gender can be more complex than we might see if we use it as a causal starting point. The way that some racist groups represent themselves and even their self-identity is hyper-masculinized, manly men, virile warriors, fighting off enemies. But like the Klan's historical continuity, the masculinist nature can be a staged representation that obscures more interesting dynamics. In the 1920s, white women were brought into the Klan, and today the Klan also recruits women. But in both cases, that they were women is somewhat beside the point. In the 1920s, white women were newly enfranchised. They were tempting bait for a Klan that was hungry for votes, because it was running for office, and dues money, because it was a pyramid financial scheme. Today, women are targeted by the right, far right, for recruitment at least as much because racist leaders see women as less likely to have criminal records and therefore less vulnerable to becoming informants for the police than are men. In both times, women were brought into racism for somewhat non-gendered reasons. By assuming a priori that gender matters in organized racism, it can be difficult to see the intriguing ways in which it does. Put another way, we may need to rethink the move from asserting that gender matters in organized racism to assuming that gender matters similarly in all times and contexts, that it can be a starting point of analysis. How gender matters requires not only that we see gender, but that we see its limits, its cracks, its fissures. To know when gender matters requires us to know also when it does not. And I want to conclude with one quick thought about the next steps toward understanding gender and organized racism. Certainly we can't move beyond these templates. They're the sea in which we scholars swim, and they're hard to see. But we can push at the ripples that we can see. We can start asking when gender is most meaningful and effectual in racist projects and when it is less so. We can think about to whom gender matters, to its leaders, to prospective members, to the public, and in what circumstances. We can ask, what does gender matter for? For recruiting women or men as a strategy or tactic? And finally, we can push our scholarly projects to consider the mechanisms by which gender matters or does not matter. When racist projects evoke gender, when they depend on gendered ideas, or when they might even erode gender. These, I think, are the next stage of work on gender and racist movements. Thank you.
Alan will respond for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then after that we'll have questions from the audience.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Kathy, for such a really exciting talk, such an exciting paper. I think it's extremely useful to think about what the scholarship has been doing up until now, what our perspectives are. And I want to point out that Professor Blee is, I think, the leading scholar on right-wing movements in the U.S. and on gender and right-wing movements in the U.S. And many of us have been reading her work for a very, very long time. She's made so many contributions in the area of ethnographies, in the area of theory, and the area of gender and women's agency, and I could go on forever, so I will stop right there. But first of all, I'd like to situate my comments. I'm not a specialist on right-wing movements in the US, and instead I work on Hindu nationalism, and also a bit on right-wing movements in France. And I say that because I think that my comments are extremely positioned in that scholarship. And so, first of all, when I first saw Professor Blee's series of templates, I found them really fascinating, but also they appeared to me a little bit like the taxonomy that Bourdieu uses to classify animals, where the thing evoked in Foucault's The Order of Things, that reproduces this taxonomy from a Chinese encyclopedia. And it did not, it's a very different kind of a categorization from what we would be thinking about in, for example, the context of Hindu nationalism, and therefore there's a lot to be learned from it, So, my comments really are, to think about, first of all, how the centrality of the question, does gender matter in organized racism, and to think about them through the delineation of the conceptual templates that Professor Blee proposes to us. The first one with the notion of the racist as male, and with that notion, in the U.S. scholarship, there's Claudia Kuntz's first excellent study, of mothers in the fatherland, which brings into view women as racist actors, in the United States. But I would say that elsewhere there were also other studies. For example, Rita Kalman, who wrote a book, Women Under the Third Reich, and Lilian Condel, who wrote about the link between women's right-wing movements in Germany, and women in feminist movements in Germany, and female Nazi activism, is a point that Professor Blee also brought out. I think that, that I'm wondering if there, and I want to ask Professor Blee about this, if there are three sort of phases. One, a phase where there's like no agency, where women are not really thought about as having agency in the U.S., and whether or not this corresponds in the U.S. to the 1970s and 1980s notion of sisterhood is powerful in in U.S. feminist theory. That this way of conceptualizing women in right-wing movements, how dependent is it also on how women's agency was theorized in feminism in the United States? So, for example, in Andrea Dworkin's 1978 work, she has a theory of which I guess Marxists would call a false consciousness. Women they get swayed by their male counterparts, and then whether or not there might be the second phase of weak agency, where that women become politically accountable, but they're not completely in control of what they're doing. That is, that they might join these movements, for reasons other than being enthusiastic about their ideologies. And then a third phase where scholars have talked a lot about strong agency and women's active choice, etc. And there I'm thinking really of Amrita Basu's work, or Tanika Sarkar's work, or some of the work in the book that Margaret Power and I co-edited, where we had lots of different types of agency. For example, agentic differentialism, agentic similitude with men. In other words, some ideas about women's agency being different from men, and others where it was exactly the same, sort of along the same model. So my question then, in relation to all that, is whether or not in the past 8 years, if you see a kind of a topology in the way that women's agency has been theorized in the literature in the U.S., whether or not there's more differentiation within that in the last 8 years in particular. The next one is about the prototype of Nazi Germany, and here I was very fascinated by the threefold division that Professor Blee put forth, the first one being Nazism's very rapid expansion, and then the second one being about the macroeconomic, political, and national crisis, and the third one being more aligned with the Frankfurt School scholarship, which is about collective pathologies, and so I think that for example, in other places we really think about the scholarship on Nazism in relation to Adorno very much, and also in relation to Reich, and not so much in relation to these other two tendencies. So that also was fascinating to me. But in it you mention how these make gender central to the analysis. For example, insofar as the authors question the production of white hyper-macho masculinities, or the production of women as being led astray by men, etc. I'm wondering also if you could elaborate about women's participation and about the analytical limitations in this particular template. Then there is the newer template on racist continuity, and Professor Blee makes the point that the scholarship on Nazi Germany, and I assume in particular the Frankfurt School analytics, now it was criticized in the US because it doesn't correspond well, and also because of its reduction of racism to an individual pathology. I just wanted to note in passing that in France and in Germany there's a really strong continuity with this scholarship, and it does not get reduced in the way that it does in the US to these kinds of things. In other words, I'm thinking, for example, of the work of Klaus Theoleit and his book Male Fantasies, in which he draws on Deleuze and Guattari's notion of operability, and which is actually a notion that helps us to think about the psychological along with the social, the political, and the materialization. And so it does not, and also the economic, and it doesn't extract it the way that, it doesn't reduce it actually to the psychological. But I think that that may be just a question of how theory travels. It doesn't always travel really in its full form, and so sometimes can get cut off from its social and political context. But anyway, I am interested in this whole realm of the shift to social movement theory. I think that's very insightful to think about that as a shift into that, and also the fact that social movement theory allows for us to study racist mobilization, strategies, tactics, etc., but has these limitations, whether it's methodological or representational, as you point out in your talk. So my question in relation to that paradigm is actually, are there any social movement theories that you find to be particularly helpful to think about the question of gender in racist movements? I mean, for example, some folks have drawn on Bourdieu, on Melucci, on Touraine, etc. And is there anyone in particular who you find to be particularly salient for the study of gender in racist movements? The fourth template was the one of causality, and this one was defined as the assumption that people are brought into racist movements because they have racist ideologies or that their beliefs precede their activisms. I want to point out that this is a really major contribution of Professor Blee actually to the literature, because in Women of the Klan, I think it was first posited in that way. She posited it in that way in her book. And so in that book also, Professor Blee provides some fascinating examples of how women and men relate to ideology differently. And I think that that's actually a central point when we're trying to analyze right-wing movements. But today, Professor Blee pointed out that we can posit that groups matter in organized racism, but that the group focus can also obscure for us the way that gender can matter. So again, I would like to hear a bit more about that point. The last template, the notion that gender always matters. And I enjoyed that critique quite a bit, because in fact there has been this sort of easy assumption, and in fact there has been, I would say even in the literature in Hindu nationalism and in the literature in France, there's been an assumption of women, pushing women's private role having its repercussions in the public space, in the organized far-right movements. The only difference would be, I would say, that in Hindu nationalism, for example, there are these very strong goddesses that women and men can model their warrior-like behavior on. So in that sense, it's very easy to queer that literature in ways that other literature is not so easily queered. I wanted to really ask a question about how would it be, are we talking about the same thing actually when we talk about gender cross-culturally? For example, I'm wondering if one new direction maybe for the research might be for us to really think closely about how we are actually theorizing gender, because in fact, in the scholarship in feminism, as Professor Blee knows very well, there are very different conceptions of gender. And so, for example, within a queer theory or queer of color theory kind of a context, there are all sorts of very different ways of thinking about gender than there would be, there are different phases in how we think about gender. So, for example, I mean, can we think, for example, with the work of Judith Halberstam about female masculinity? Can we think about male femininity? Could we think about gender sort of inseparably, for example, in its co-constitutions or in the work of E. Patrick Johnson, interanimations with, with race, sexualities, etc., and sort of as in its inseparabilities. So those are questions that I have for you. And I'm going to stop here in the interest of time because I know other people really would like to ask many questions. And again, I just want to thank Professor Blee for an absolutely brilliant and very clear talk today. Thank you very much.
I wanted to offer anything, have any questions about the ethnographic part of this study, the methodology? Okay.
Yeah, so I could build on this one.
Okay.
And yeah, mostly about these students, a lot of these photographs are either created by you or presented by you, and I'm wondering how you got access, I mean, just from your comments, you seem to not share the sentiments of your informants. So I'm wondering how that became a, what kind of broker are you?
The photographs are photographs that I acquired, but they're not photographs I took because the people I interviewed, I have confidentiality agreements with, so I couldn't photograph them. These are other people. These are people that I interviewed for this study.
Do they see their information they're giving you as serving their agenda?
Yes. This is a complicated question, but anybody who's done interviewing with people, especially extensive interviewing, people talk a lot more than you expect them to, and a lot more openly than you expect them to, because people do see the act of talking about their lives as a way of serving their agenda, right? In addition, these people see it maybe, they saw it as potentially serving the interests of their groups. But right from the start, I had to struggle with them because usually sociologists give confidentiality agreements to protect the interviewee. But in this case, these people did not want to be confidential. They did not want to be anonymous. They wanted me to write their names and their group names. They wanted to use me as a vehicle to publicize their groups. So they were a little annoyed that I wouldn't use their names or their groups' names. But yes, people are very willing to talk in the interest of serving their own interest to a scholar. And these people certainly thought that was a possibility, and were annoyed that it wasn't a possibility. Now, on a deeper level, there's a larger issue here that is not only about the women I interviewed in the contemporary racist movement, I also interviewed people in the 1920s who were in the Klan in the 1920s. So I interviewed them in the 80s, I guess. Yeah, they were extremely old, right? But I interviewed a number of surviving women's Klan members. And one of the sort of the ethical issues here is that even though I didn't use her name and their Klan doesn't exist and so forth anymore, recovering that story, gives it an importance in history that is powerful and disturbing, right? So one of the real issues in studying the far right is even if you don't publicize a person's group or their name and you take all kinds of cautions, by studying the right, you kind of are creating an historical importance and record for it that you have to really think about ethically and politically. Now, there's other factors I think that can outweigh that and take a little bit of comfort in the fact that exposing groups also teaches people how they recruit and how one can stop them. But I think that even groups that are long gone, like the 1920s Klan, can be resurrected, you know, as important to research. Long answer. Yeah.
Just a slightly different question about this. Some of your comments about the Nazi template. I just wanted to get your reactions on this a little bit. I mean, it was fascinating talk and so on, but I wasn't so sure that this comparative template is quite as useless as you sometimes seem to suggest. And I guess there were a couple of ways in which that was true. First, it would seem to me that studying the far right in the US is a major confirmation of the importance of all of these different macro structural crises. That is, precisely their absence in the US case explains why a far right-wing movement has never remotely come near political power or, you know, taken on the dimensions of either National Socialism or fascism. So that was one thing. The other point is that most of the scholarship on fascism and Nazism emphasizes its agrarian origins. This is a central strand. I mean, of course, there's the kind of Frankfurt School literature, but there's also, you know, the whole other sort of, you know, class-based literature that really emphasizes agrarian smallholders as a central bearer of right-wing ideology, and these seem not so different from, you know, people from rural Indiana in a lot of ways. So that was another point. And then the third is, if we look at it this way, what is the phenomenon that we're trying to explain with sort of radical right-wing movements in the U.S.? Is it the presence, or is it the surprising weakness of these movements? I'd just like to get your reactions on that in general.
Well, starting with the issue of the German Nazi template, I wasn't trying to describe the literature in Nazi Germany, but only to talk about how it was used and received by people doing work on racist movements in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And there are virtues to that literature, for sure, but its effect on scholarship in the U.S. was mostly to send people off onto kind of dead ends. So even the 1920s Indiana, it wasn't in the rural areas, but was strong in Indianapolis and Gary. So it was not a rural agrarian thing. So it kind of, because that was such a heavy template, it just pushed people into this kind of monocausal search, and not that those factors are completely absent in all cases, but it caused people to miss factors that I think were more significant in the U.S. context. Whether you can say it explains why there haven't been large right-wing movements in the U.S., although outside of the 20s, but that's a huge movement. 5 million members in the Klan. It was a very big movement in the 1920s. After that, not so much. So I'm just trying to say, not that all those factors are mislead or unimportant, but they didn't account for the particular case. I'm sorry, your other question was about?
Well, it follows on from, I mean, you say 5 million members is a big movement, which it surely is, but the point being that this is not ever a viable option for the U.S. It's not going to. These movements don't come near power, and so is that not important? And does that not actually confirm the macro causal theories that say, well, you need to sort of have these other crises in place in order to have? It's just that.
Right. I mean, it might. I mean,
yeah,
sort of arguing by the absence. Right. But it made it hard to explain the particular movements that existed in the U.S., I'd say.
So I guess following up on his comments as well, when you're looking at where we are now as a country, and we're looking at unorganized racism, especially with things like immigration reform and the way the macro is coming down to folks of color, how would you then look at the role that women play in that? How does gender play into unorganized racism?
Today? Well, yeah, she's asking about how gender plays in today's unorganized racism. actually, the organized racism that I'm talking about here doesn't exist so much in the last 5 years in the United States. Even organized racism is much more disorganized racism than it was 5 or certainly 10 years ago, because for a variety of reasons, including that these groups have come under Homeland Security, so they are working to dissolve themselves as groups and to just be very loosely affiliated, kind of what they imagine Al-Qaeda cells are like. So they want to be kind of loosely affiliated, small cells that you can't infiltrate and prosecute. So in some ways, organized racism doesn't exist so much anymore. It's more disorganized racism. The consequence of that for gender is very unclear. These groups are extremely hard to study now because they're tiny little cells, unconnected. It's very difficult to contact them. If you're asking about sort of racism outside of that context and how women play into that, I mean, that's a different question that I'm not as expert on for sure. But there's a pretty vast gulf between the racist ideas of these groups and the racist ideas of sort of people out there who are racist, who are not in these groups. So it's not that these groups have just a little more extreme version of your kind of everyday white person's racism. They have a really profoundly different kind of racist ideas that they develop once they're in these groups. So for example, not only are they racist, but a lot of these groups think the real problem is that Jews manipulate whites and persons of color. So some of these groups, in fact, think racism is something that should be abolished because everyone should just focus on Jews as a real enemy. They are extremely anti-Christian, most of these groups. They don't have a national framing. They're not necessarily anti-immigration. Some of these groups are pro-immigration because they're trying to do anything to destroy the U.S. federal government, which they see as a real problem. They're interested in worldwide Aryan supremacy. So they're not just a little bit more racist than kind of racist out there. They have a totally different kind of imagining and enactment of racism.
You said that you didn't want to globalize issues like gender or race, but I guess I wonder how do you differentiate these groups? You just explained some of it, but in terms of the right wing within the Republican Party, the teabaggers, which all seem to have a very strong racist component. I mean, at what point do you distinguish them? And I mean, how is that distinction so clear?
Yeah, actually, we were talking about this Larry and I before the session today, and of course there's some similarities. I don't want to say there's no similarities between the far right of the kind of mainstream right and these groups, but more importantly is the pretty vast gulf between them. So people don't easily slide from even the far right of the quote respectable right into these groups or vice versa. So for example, most of these groups are pro-abortion, they're anti-Christian. I mean, they just have a different conception of race and politics than even the far right. So the far right of the respectable right sort of has a national frame, a Christian frame, through which they see the world. These groups really don't. So there's not like an easy slide.
Maybe these groups, the right-wing Republicans and teabaggers, are the new right racist groups. I mean, that's what I'm guessing.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So they're taking on that place.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, as far as I know, they're not armed, right? Or they're not armed and trying to commit apocalyptic violence like these groups are. Whether they're headed that way or not.
They may have more political control.
But they're more like the Klan in the 20s in some ways. Yeah.
I'm just curious if you say that they do a lot of recruiting in everyday day-to-day situations and then you say that there's a vast divide between people who know the far right and this movement. How do they go about it? What
Yeah, this is where I'm a real sociologist. What happens is that the group really matters. So they come into these groups. You won't believe these people are in these groups for a long time, often without even kind of getting what the group's about. So they just are hanging out with people. They're drinking buddies. They're into violence, or they're just into working on this kind of keep our community pure environment, quality of life thing. They're in with these races. Often they don't even get that. And as they're in these groups for a while, then they get told the secret, you know. So they kind of learn to trust the people in the groups, and then the people in these actual races reveal things to them. And it's, you know, it's like peeling away the onion. Then they tell them these more secrets, they trust them more, they tell them more secrets, and they start believing this kind of really hardcore conspiratorial ideas that make it impossible to get out from under. So, for example, once they're in one of the big secrets that they learn is that Jews control everything. So, like most people come into racist groups, these white people, they're already kind of racist because most white people are kind of racist, so they just have your kind of everyday white person's racism. But they tend not to have much anti-Semitism because it's just not part of their world. That's something they just learn in the group. That's really a product of the group. So, for example, if I ask people why they're racist, they'll give me a story. Everyone's got a story, right? Everyone's got a narrative. And it'll be like stupid, but it's a narrative, you know. So it'll be like I was in 4th grade, I sat next to this girl on the bus, she was always mean to me, took my lunch money, you know, something. So it'll be a personal anecdote that seems to be kind of a watershed moment in which they realize that all persons of color were evil or terrible. Okay, so it's like a personal story they could tell. Now, I say it's crazy because it reads back into their lives something that probably had no racial significance at the time, even if it did happen, right? But nonetheless, they've got that story. So if I say, okay, but really you seem to be most agitated about Jews, like, so could you just give me a comparable story, like what got you so hostile about Jews? Like, they don't have a story. So, you know, I said, well, like somebody you didn't like, somebody knew, somebody you read about in the paper, you know, kind of help me out here. There's no story. Because the whole thing about Jews is something they learn in the group. That's really a product of the group. There's no personal thing in their life that they can even retrospectively construct as a watershed moment. So that's what I mean. They come to these groups, they learn these secrets, and then that kind of reformats their life, and they look back to their past and they see, you know, here's how I became a racist, here's how I learned the truth. So they are, it's amazing what changed it me. Yeah.
Where you said that some of the groups are pro-immigrant, but where would you classify, for example, a group like immigrant or like little small cells that are like either anti-immigrant but they have like an internal and external narrative?
Yeah. Now, the groups like the Minutemen are not part of this study. They are actually sort of this liminal group, and it's kind of unclear which way groups like the Minutemen are going to go. They are obviously extremely anti-immigrant and nationalistic, so they still have that nationalism. They don't have allegiance to neo-Nazi groups in Europe, South Africa or something. They see their focus as protecting the U.S. The groups I'm studying see their focus as destroying the U.S. Very different kind of focus, right? I mean, these are the Timothy McVeigh people. They want to blow up the U.S. They don't want to save it from immigrants. But some of these anti-immigrant groups, it's possible they might make some kind of transition into Aryanism, but haven't yet, as far as I know. But they seem like the one group that's kind of possible. The other group that was kind of possible at one time were some of the militia. Some of them did sort of slip into that Aryan stuff. Most of them didn't, but that's an interesting point.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious, what brought you to this kind of work and what's your motivations?
Well, what brought me was that I found, quite by accident, a pamphlet from the 1920s Klan in favor of women's suffrage, and I just got really interested in it. And that's when there were a few people still alive, and so I interviewed these elderly Klanswomen. And when I was talking about that project in public, people, they're kind of interested in the 20s, but they really wanted to know about what was happening with women in the far right now. And somehow I got the idea, like, I had managed to stand down these 90-year-olds, so it shouldn't be any problem dealing with, armed 20-year-olds. That turned out to be a kind of a tactical error, but I had an inflated sense of my ability to maneuver in that world and started studying women in the current right, and do that project for a long time. I'm not doing it now. Actually, I don't think you could do it now because, first of all, the groups are dissolving, and they're much smaller now. They're much harder to find, to infiltrate, and they're much, much more dangerous. They're more dangerous internally, and because of the internet, they're more dangerous to study because you Google my name, they post all kinds of crazy stuff. So it used to be people would just send you, the opposite of fan mail, but now they put things on the internet, and there's all these sort of lone wolf violent practitioners out there. Who's ever thinking about studying this, let me talk you out of it. It's a very difficult area to study right now. It's also a very difficult time to get any kind of rapport. I managed to get rapport with these women, but I don't know that you could do that right now.
So you mentioned how you were in studying these groups and kind of bringing them some historical significance. And I myself am also interested in studying the Minutemen, and I struggle with being interested in understanding these organizations, but at the same time giving them significance and coming from Berkeley, I would say symbolic capital. How do you see your studies as beneficial, not necessarily for these organizations, but a positive impact for society as a whole?
Well, when I did the second study, I was aware of this problem of creating importance for a group from my 20 study. And so I designed the study working with anti-racist groups around the country in different places, asking them what it was they needed to know. I worked with anti-gang police, all kinds of people. And I thought, as a scholar, rather than just do a book and create a set of importance to this group, I would try to actually answer some questions that people in the field needed to know. So, for example, one of the things that they needed to know was how to get people out of these groups. They had kind of a grip on how to get men out, but they didn't have any grip on how to get women out, because women are sort of more hidden through layers of these groups. They're harder to get out of the groups. And so that's one of the things that I worked to find out. And the thing I found was that these groups are extremely insular. So if you're in the group, you're not supposed to have contact with the people outside the group, really, except at your workplace or something. But you're supposed to always have a facade when you're talking to what they call aliens. Aliens are anybody who's not in the group. So you always have a facade. But it turned out these women, every woman I ever met had one person that she had a secret conduit to outside of the group that she maintained contact with. Her husband didn't know, group leaders didn't know. So her sister, some friend from high school, somebody they knew who was an alien that they were still maintaining contact with. And so in the same way that women leave abusive situations more safely if they have conduit out, right? So the same with these women, that is a safer way to leave. It makes it more possible, it also makes it safe, because it's dangerous to leave these groups. It's really, really dangerous. You can't just say, change my mind. You know who's in the groups, you can't just walk out of them. So you need kind of a safe passage out, and that was one. So that would be one suggestion.
I have a question that may be a little bit out of context. I'm just trying to compare from the perspective of the Italian kind of racism that's now, and of course the history and relationship with the fascism is obviously very different. But I just was wondering if there is a similar perception that small and outside groups from the right wing can do they have a sense of how they participate in the general spectrum of the right wing? Or do they see themselves, what is their position? Because from my perspective, the kind of marginal, extra-governmental, extra-parliamentary, very extreme in their discursive level, they do understand that there's a kind of division or label between them and the larger right-wing parties in terms of like allowing the right-wing parties that are more popular to have legitimation because they pose themselves as opposed to this farther right spectrum. So there is a knowledge of that. I don't know if this is the case with the groups that you studied.
That's really an interesting question. Now, the groups that I studied, they have nothing but disdain for people that we would consider people on the right, far right Republicans, anything. They disdain those, they consider them puppets of Jews and so forth. So they're not interested. But on the other hand, the question of whether they see themselves as a movement or as a larger thing is, in fact, a really contested question. The tendency in the U.S. far right is to infinitely fragment. So, in fact, a lot of the violence that goes on in the far right is violence between these groups, not violence between these groups and us, right? They're shooting each other more than they're shooting anybody else. So there's a lot of conflict and contestation and very little interest often in seeing themselves as having a joint project. So even though to us it looks like they're all doing the same thing, to them they couldn't be farther apart. But there have been efforts by people who are self-proclaimed leaders to try to create that sense. So now there's, the last 15 years, there's this thing called the fifth era, which is this term that is bantied about everywhere to try to convince all these people that they're in the same project, that they're the fifth era, kind of supposed to be the fifth era of the Klan, but more broadly, that all these movements have a common focus and project despite their individual hatred of each other. So it comes and goes how much any particular group adheres to this fifth era thing. But that's an interesting example of that kind of imposed representation. Every once in a while they try to have a fifth era meeting, which always ends up as a complete disaster. But nonetheless, a few groups are trying to embrace that idea. But the centrifugal force is very strong in the far right.
I'm going to take this opportunity to thank both of our speakers. This has been extraordinary. Thank you everybody for coming as well.